Welcome to week 3 of the music of the Beatles here on Coursera. And this week we'll spend mostly talking about what happened with the Beatles and their music in 1965. As you remember, in previous weeks, the first week we really sort of took it up to 1963. Last week was 1964, and so here we head into 1965. And one of the here are some of the themes that we're going to cover over the course of this week's lecture, just to kind of give you a summary of some of the main points of what my main arguments are going to be. I said in 1964 with A Hard Day's Night that the Beatles kind of reached the kind of peak or a certain arriving place, point of arrival as pop craftsmen. That is, people who saw their job as putting together, great pop songs. Not artists, but craftspeople, and a great pop song, results hopefully in a hit record and stardom and all that kind of thing. So 1964 was really a mark of success, and A Hard Day's Night really is that album. Then I made the argument that toward the end of 1964, you begin to see the Beatles, I think, recalibrating their style a little bit, starting to push on the boundaries, maybe not satisfied with just repeating what they did with A Hard Day's Night. A lot of people see that album as being a kind of a weak successor to A Hard Day's Night, but I see it as an important precursor to what's happening in 1965. And what's happening in 1965 as the Beatles move a lot closer, or travel a much farther distance in 1965 than they did in 64, toward the artist model. And we'll come back to this idea of the artist model a number of times during the week as we focus in on the material. And in fact, if I have a bias in choosing which pieces that I talk about, I'm going to choose the pieces that really sort of show this transformation happening, at the risk of maybe making it seem like that's all that was happening, but I'll try to balance that by telling you that still a lot of what was happening with A Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale, the craftsman approach, is still a big part of what's happening in 1965. But as we move toward the artist model, what exactly does that mean? Well, it means the lyrics become more serious. Remember talking about the meeting with Dylan in August or September of 1964, and them kind of challenging, or at least suggesting to the Beatles they might move beyond the sort of boy meets girl, boy kisses girl, holds your hand, she loves you kind of thing, into something more serious. And so what you'll see over 65 is the lyrics become more serious. The forms become more varied, that is. I've made a big point of talking about how prevalent the AABA form is, and I've basically made the argument that AABA is kind of synonymous with pop songwriting coming out of the great American songbook tradition of Tin Pan Alley and that kind of thing. So to see it seems to be an indication that the Beatles are totally buying into the idea of pop songwriting and using the form, one of the forms that's most often associated with it. Now, as they begin to move away from that model, maybe the better idea is to expand their portfolio so that it's not only this craft thing. The forms will become more varied, and we'll see that as we start to look through the tunes this week. New instruments come to be used, so the old idea of 2 guitars, bass, drums, vocals, there's still plenty of that, but we're going to see some new instruments coming in to the recordings as they begin to experiment with expanding their style. And they also start to look at styles outside of the pop rock of 1965, starting to reference other styles, classical music, avant-garde music to a certain extent, in this case, French popular song. You're starting to see them sort of expand stylistically in terms of instrumental color, in terms of varied forms, and in terms of meaningful lyrics. That's what it means to move increasingly from the craft model to the artist model. So that's one of the big stories we're going to talk about in 1965. Let's do a quick review of important events that span the year 1965. We'll of course come back to the albums and the music and some of those kinds of things as we continue to talk. But here's a sort of an overview. The Beatles continued to dominate the charts in the United States, in the UK. But I have to say that what's surprising when you go back and look at some of the press coverage that they got and what some people were saying about the Beatles, that still there was this expectation that any minute now they could fall off the top of the charts and go back to obscurity. There was still the suspicion that they were still something like the flavor of the week. Now it was the flavor of the month. Maybe now it's become the flavor of the year. But still, something had to give. It couldn't continue. But in fact, it did. Interestingly enough, John and George have their first LSD trip in spring of 1965, which seems very early because we think of summer of 1967 as being the summer of love and the breakout of psychedelia. To think that the Beatles, two of the Beatles at least, had experienced LSD over 2 years before all of that, I think is instructive. Remembering as well that they've been exposed to marijuana in the second half of 1964. John's second book, A Spaniard in the Works, was published in June of 1965. His first book, In His Own Right, had been published in 1964. These two books, if you haven't read them, they're a lot of fun. They're great sort of John Lennon kind of wordplay and sarcasm and outrageous humor and a lot of that kind of thing. But it really did kind of help to build the image of John Lennon as being more the sort of literary, more the kind of words guy, whereas Paul McCartney is often seen more as the music guy. Now, it often turns out that Paul's got great lyrics and John's got great music, so that's maybe a little bit too facile a distinction to make. But still, the fact that John Lennon had now written two books kind of reinforced him as a kind of literary type of person. Help, the movie and the album were released in the summer of 1965 in August. The Beatles play the first Shea Stadium concert for 55,000 fans in August of 1965. That's often seen as a real sort of high watermark for a live performance, to play Shea Stadium, to play a sports stadium and have all these people show up. Nobody had really done anything quite like that before. In August of 1965, the Beatles also meet Elvis Presley, and you may try to find on the internet or various spots a new documentary that I just recently heard about being made about the day Elvis met the Beatles. That's something that I'm looking forward to checking out myself. A lot of stories told about that meeting. The Beatles received their MBE awards in Great Britain in October of 1965. Somewhat of a scandal for some of the older generation who actually sent their MBEs back because the Beatles got theirs. And then Rubber Soul is released in December of 1965. So as we look at the two big albums for 1965, we've got A Hard Day's Night, A Help occurring in the summer of 65, and then Rubber Soul at the end of the year in December of 1965. Let's take a quick look at the singles, because remembering that Beatles for Sale came out at the end of 64, and then there wasn't another new album out until August of 65. How did they fill that space? Remember, in popular music, if you're off the charts, out of mind, right? So you got to keep stuff on the charts. But this is still, at this point in the music business, singles are still the important unit of trade. Albums are kind of secondary. When we talk about Sgt. Pepper, we'll talk about how that flips and how the album starts to become the important thing. But right now, singles are the thing. So if you want to see how the Beatles were sort of still present on the charts, you need to look at the singles. So 8 Days a Week, which we talked about last week, had been drawn from Beatles for Sale, was released in February of 1965 and went to #1. So as of February, they had a #1 hit. The B side of that, by the way, was I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. 8 Days a Week being a Paul song, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party being a John song. Then in April of 65, another #1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic with John's Ticket to Ride. The B side of that was Yes It Is. Yes It Is an interesting track, also a John song, because it's a reworking of an earlier Beatles song, This Boy. Both This Boy and Yes It Is kind of show their debt to early rhythm and blues, doo-wop, African-American sort of pop singing groups. So you can really see that. Yes, It Is, again, reworking This Boy also shows us something about the Beatles going back to the older formula, as if they'd done something before, they could try doing it again. The song Help is released along with the, just before the album and the movie in July of 65. That's, of course, a John song, with the B side of that being I'm Down, a Paul song. And then Yesterday, a Paul song, which was on Help, was released as a single in September of 1965 in the U.S. only, and went to #1. The B-side of that was Act Naturally. And then at the very end of the year, together with the release of Rubber Soul, we get the single, the sort of double A-sided single, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. So you can see that as I've gone through all of these singles during the course of the year, you can see the Beatles every couple of months have got something newly released on the charts, sort of staying in the public eye, as I said before, off the charts, out of mind. And so with this sort of steady succession of hit singles, and then of course we've got the movies and the albums to go with that. So in the next video, let's turn our attention to the Beatles' second movie, this one called Help.